All right, so this is going to be a continuation of the video that just stopped. So the fourth video. So basically, my internet messed up and cut off on me, and so we're just going to continue with our discussion. And so, as I was saying, the exoskeleton, during this molting process, leaves the animal temporarily vulnerable to predators and other factors in the environment, whether it's drying out or being stepped on or, some other random effect happening. And so that molting process is really important in that species kind of life cycle, and they're pretty vulnerable during that time frame. Now, here's a typical, anatomy, typical structures of a crustacean, with looking at the different appendages. So you see here you have different appendages, and appendages can be modified, right, for different functions. So you have your walking appendages, you have a modified swimming appendage, which is the tail on the abdomen. You have your pincers, your claws, your walking legs, again, which are modified. You have mouth parts, right? And all of these are just modified appendages that are serving different structures. Now, with arthropods, there are typically three body parts, three segments in the body: the abdomen, the head, and the thorax. Okay, and depending on the group and the species, these body parts can be merged into like one body part, or they can be separated into their own part. So for example, this lobster has a cephalothorax, which is the head and the thorax combined. So cephala referring to head. So it's like your head thorax area, and then it has its abdomen, right? And again, depending on which organism you're looking at from the group, the different segments will be kind of more obvious or reduced or less obvious. Okay? And so the first group we're going to look at in arthropods are the arachnids. So this is your scorpions, your spiders, your ticks, and your mites. These are usually terrestrial, although there are some aquatic species. They typically have 4 pairs of walking legs and then a specialized pair of feeding appendages that are at the front of the mouth, right, that help them bring that food into their mouth. And so with your arachnids, you think of them as your 8-legged arthropods, right? So your spiders, your scorpions are kind of your more obvious ones, but a lot of us will tend to forget about ticks and mites unless you live in an area where they exist, and they actually have 8 legs, and so they're an arthropod. Your spiders will also have some modified appendages that are important for making their webs, so those silk spinning appendages. And again, depending on the species, so like your scorpion will have modified claw appendages, and then it also has that tail, which is used for defense and also used for a mechanism to subdue their prey, right, to poison and kill their prey. Now, crustaceans, which are the second group, they include crabs, lobsters, crayfish, shrimp, and barnacles. So they're mostly aquatic organisms. They will anchor themselves to different substrates. So for example, barnacles will do that. Your crabs, lobsters, crayfish, and shrimp are very mobile and will move around. And like we saw with the lobsters, they have lots of specialized appendages for swimming, walking, defense, etc. And all of them are aquatic, except for a group of isopods that live on the land. And so if you're familiar with the roly-polies or the pill bugs, the character from A Bug's Life, those are actually crustaceans. They're not insects. And so they're from the crustacean group. And so they all have these characteristic multiple pair of specialized appendages that we find in arthropods. And so this is the pill bug here, that roly-poly. Here's your barnacles that are attached to different substrates, your shrimp, your crayfish, your crabs, lots of different species of crabs, lots of different species of shrimps and barnacles. And then here is just an anatomical image showing the different structures. So 3 or more pairs of legs. They have the antenna. They have feeding appendages. All right, and so again, most of them are aquatic species, with that small group of isopod species being terrestrial. Okay. So the third group of arthropods that we're going to look at are the millipedes and the centipedes. So millipedes and centipedes are terrestrial, and one of these groups are carnivorous, and the other is are detritivores. And what's interesting with millipedes and centipedes is that they have repeating segments over the length of their body. So they have a really long abdomen, and it's kind of extended to create those repeating segments. And with centipedes, they only have 1 pair of legs per body segment. So you may have heard like centipedes having 100 legs, right? Which is centi, right? 100. And that comes from the idea that they have 1 leg per segment, and so they have only 100 legs. Right? Whereas millipedes actually have 2 pairs per body segment, and so they have many more legs. And so that's where the idea of milli comes from. So lots of legs, so way more than 100. But in reality, they don't really have 100 legs, but they do have a lot. Whereas they have several different body segments with 1 leg per segment. Right? Millipedes are the detritivores of these 2 groups, so they eat decaying plant matter. Centipedes are the carnivorous group within these 2, and they actually have a pair of poison claws that can paralyze their prey so that they can consume them, and those claws are also used as defense mechanisms. So here you have a millipede, so with 2 pairs of legs per segment, and then you have your centipede with 1 pair of legs per segment. So you can see this centipede doesn't really have 100 legs, but it's still quite a bit, right? And this one doesn't have 1,000 pair of legs, right? Or 1,000 legs, right? But they still, again, have a lot of legs. And you can see that elongated, middle area, lots of different repeating segments, which is a key characteristic of those groups. Okay. So the last group we're going to talk about is by far the most diverse group of animals, and this is the insects. The insects have these 3 body part anatomy. So they have that separated head, thorax, and abdomen. The insect head typically will have a pair of antennae and then a pair of eyes, with some mouth parts that are adapted for a specialized type of feeding, depending on what type of insect it is. It could feed on nectar, it could feed on leaves, and so they would have mouth parts that are specialized and evolved for feeding on that specific type of food source. One of the kind of key factors that have allowed insects to be super successful is the fact that a lot of insects can fly. And that has allowed them to not only occupy, terrestrial and aquatic environments, but it's also added a 3rd dimension and allowed them to occupy, the upper environment that you only could reach, say, if you were able to fly, the arboreal environments, and actually traversing from those environments. And flight also has allowed them to be able to migrate long distances. So, for example, the monarch butterfly migrates long distances throughout its life cycle, and all that's made possible because of the presence of wings. And so insects, again, like I just mentioned, can live in almost every terrestrial habitat, fresh water, the air. We don't really find a lot of insects in the seas, and that's typically where you see crustaceans as a dominant arthropod. And we don't really see a lot of crustaceans on land, like the roly-poly is pretty much all we see. And so it's insects occupying the terrestrial environment, crustaceans dominating the aquatic environment. And so here's that typical structure of an insect. You have your head, your thorax, your abdomen with those pairs of antennae, and then the mouth parts and those complex eye structures that allow them to navigate their environment. And like we mentioned, insect diversity is just really large. They're the most diverse group of animals. They live, you know, in all the different terrestrial environments. You have insects that range from bees to flies to insects that are beneficial for humans in terms of, you know, keeping pests off their crops or pollinating their crops. Or you can have insects that carry disease, like mosquitoes that carry malaria or West Nile. You have insects that are parasitic. And so there are lots of different specializations in the insect world. It almost seems like insects have evolved to take advantage of almost every single niche that's available. And so they're really diverse, really specialized, lots of different species. This is just a small summary of examples for species of insects that exist. And so again, just really diverse, really unique group of animals. And one kind of key characteristic with insects is that they actually undergo a metamorphosis. So the young will have a different physical appearance than their adult form. So they would typically have like a larvae that will metamorphose into a different adult stage. And each series of metamorphosis and molts that insect goes through will become more and more like the adult, you know, final stage. And in some cases, you'll have these distinct larval and adult stages, or you can have those proportional kind of stepwise successionary body proportional stages within insects. So pretty interesting in that way. And so that's it for our overview of the ecdysozoans. So up until now, we've talked about the history of animals, the evolutionary history, how we think they evolved. We talked about the basal animal groups, which are the sponges and the cnidarians. We talked about the first group of protostomes, which were the lophotrochozoans. We talked about the second group of protostomes, which are the ecdysozoans. And then now we're going, in our next and final video, we're going to talk about the deuterostomes, which are the echinoderms and the chordates. And the chordates are the vertebrates. So a lot of the animals that you're probably more familiar with. And so with that, we'll see you in the next and final video for our animal module.